Hello. Welcome to Books in the World. This is a collaboration with the Cape Cod Writers Center. My name is Richard Bodertha, and I'll be your host here today. Our guests are Reverend David Purdy and his wife, Pamela Chatterton Purdy. Good afternoon. Nice to have you here.
Nice to be here.
And we'll be talking about their recent book called Icons of the Civil Rights Movement, Dispelling White Privilege. Reverend Purdy, let me just start with you and about the idea for this project and how it happened to come to fruition.
It began, this is really a continuation of two other books that were previously done. They were entirely of the icons that Pam has done. Icons.
Now, by icons, we're looking here at the set, and I believe
Yes.
these are the icons that
Yes.
Pamela has done as an artist. And there's several individuals throughout the history of the civil rights movement who you pay particular homage to.
Right.
And you've developed, Pamela has these icons.
Right.
And can you describe a little bit about what an icon is?
Maybe Pam ought to try to do that
Well,
first, and then.
I initially did icons of 9/11 on canvas. When we went to the South in 2004 and visited all the iconic areas of the movement, when we got to the Lorraine Motel and I'm standing on the spot where King was assassinated, tears running down my face, I said, you know what? As an artist, I can make sure these people are never forgotten. Came home, I did 16 of them initially in 3.5 months, and they're now 36. This one actually over here is 37.
Now, what are they made of, or how did you
Well,
make
David
them?
and I go to the lumber yard and buy 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of 3/4-inch plywood, put it on top of the car, get it home, goes back on the picnic table. The designs I draw out, and David helps me cut the major shape with heavy cutting saws.
Yeah.
All right.
The rest of it I do with a band saw, coping saw. There are found pieces, there are locks and keys and chains and all kinds of symbolic pieces in my artwork.
Now, your involvement in the civil rights movement predates the icons.
Oh, yes.
I believe even in 1963, you mentioned in the book that your first job was with Ebony
Was it
Magazine.
Ebony Magazine? Yes.
And you did the layout for the advertisements.
I did lots of advertising, and you know, as a 23-year-old, I was white. I did not know what white privilege was until somebody came to me one day, and Carla was her name, and she said, you know, we'd like to look at this house in the suburbs to buy. Would you make the phone call to the realtor? I said, Carla, why don't you make the call? She says, my voice is black. I'll never get the appointment. I said, really? I called, lovely speech, talk. Oh, Carla, you've got it made. She comes in Monday morning with this long face. As soon as they saw the color of my skin, sorry, it went under agreement this morning. So it was like inoculations over the years as to the privilege I always had that others did not.
Right. And David, about this time, you were in the seminary at Yale
That's
Divinity
right.
School, correct?
Yep. One of the first experiences I had with racism, blatant racism, was when I was in college.
At Amherst.
At Amherst College, yeah. The fraternities were, in order for the fraternities to continue to exist at Amherst, they had to be open. And I was going to be in a class.
This is early 60s?
This was in
59?
57, probably 57.
Okay.
And one of the people in the group that I was going to be joining with was a black student from Virginia. And he was in that same group that I was in. And when the National heard about it, they were beside themselves. There was a national convention that summer of 57, yeah. And I went with some other people from the fraternity, and we heard this unbelievable upsetness with the fact that we had taken in Reuben. Mm-hmm. And they talked about the white star of Phi Gamma Delta would be stained forever by the color of this black man's. It was just horrific. And, you know, I was a I'd grown up in a white suburb, you know, but there's something about this that was just so terrible. And that fall, that event took place in August. That fall, in September, the Little Rock 9 were integrating the school in Arkansas, Little Rock. And so some of the things we try to do with this book is to show the events in our lives and how they correspond with things that are going on with the civil rights movement at the same time.
Yeah,
And
some of the book is concurrent with your life. I mean,
Exactly.
you were married in '63, I believe.
That's
Right.
correct. Yep.
And at that point, you were at Yale Divinity School.
I just finished at Yale, yes.
Okay.
Right. And Pam had just finished at
All
the
right.
university.
And you had a
UNH.
teacher there who was well known in
Right.
in the civil rights movement, William Sloane Coffin, I believe.
Yes, yes, yes.
And he told you once the Freedom Rides began,
Yeah, yes.
you wanted to do that. You wanted to go down south on a Freedom Ride. Can you first off tell us what, for our viewers who might not know, who are a little too young to recall, the Freedom Ride? What was their genesis? What were they about? I know in the early '60s, travel it had to be segregated.
Yes.
The federal court said interstate travel cannot be segregated.
That's correct.
So the Freedom Riders tried
Tested
to
that.
test that.
That's
because
correct.
some of the locales, the states and everything, wanted to abide by their old sort of Jim Crow.
Customs, that's right.
But explain a little bit about the Freedom Rides, how they got started, what their intent was, who the main players were.
Well, there's a whole about 10 books on that subject. But
Yeah.
anyway, they got started in 1961. They grew out of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. And the intent was to have blacks and whites together to ride public trailways and Greyhound buses from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans that summer. And so they used a lot of college students and so on.
And 3 of them were actually killed by the Ku Klux Klan.
None of the Freedom Riders were killed.
Oh.
That was the amazing thing about that.
Their buses were set on fire.
The bus was set, yes,
Okay.
yeah, the first bus was set on fire in Anniston, Alabama. And mercifully, everyone escaped alive. And as a result of that, CORE kind of pulled out of the Freedom Ride. But then there was a group of students in Nashville who had just started SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were even a little more intent on keeping the Freedom Rides alive. And they said it doesn't matter. If we let violence prevail, then we have to be even more nonviolent in the face of that violence. And
They didn't want to see violence prevail over nonviolence.
over
That's right.
nonviolence. That's exactly right. And so they then continued to organize the Freedom Rides. And even though in the second and third Freedom Rides they were beaten when they got off the bus in Montgomery, and people like John Lewis, who's a very famous
He's a representative from Georgia.
He's
currently
a
served,
yeah, he's been there
for probably
Years.
40 years.
Yes.
very long time, yeah. He was among them and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then they ended up, finally, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, did work out an arrangement where the buses would travel without violence.
Robert Kennedy first tried to dissuade them.
Yes,
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 he did.
yes.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And
Tell them about Diane Nash.
Diane Nash, who's represented in one of the icons, not one of these here, but in the book,
Mm-hmm.
was a 20-year-old college student at Fisk University in Nashville when Robert Kennedy's representative, his name was
Siegenthaler.
Siegenthaler. Yeah.
He was Attorney General or Assistant
He was the
Attorney-
Assistant Attorney General
Right.
for civil rights. Tried to persuade them not to do it. He said, Robert Kennedy wishes he wouldn't do this. Someone's going to die. We can't prevent that from happening. And she said, will you go and tell that Mr. Kennedy that we have signed our last wills and testaments, we are riding. And,
Incredible courage.
and they did.
So all the riders on the Freedom Rides signed a last will.
At least
In
that,
case-
at
At
least
least-
that early group did. I don't know after that how many did.
Right.
So I was at Yale Divinity School, and I thought I had a summer ahead of me and said, gee, that would be interesting to do, you know. Of
Now,
course,
you're married at this point.
No, we didn't get married for a couple more years.
Okay.
But, so I talked to Bill Coffin, who was the chaplain at Yale and on the Yale Divinity School faculty and so on, and very famous because he was very active in civil rights and against
Burning draft cards.
and the anti-war movement and so on. And he dissuaded me from doing that. Mm-hmm. And he recommended that I work at an inner city parish in Cleveland that summer, and I did. So I didn't go on one of the Freedom Rides after all.
Right.
And
okay. Well, let's get back a little bit to the icons that look fabulous in the book. And can you give us some touchstones, who they are? I know, obviously, Martin Luther King.
Well, there's 36 of them.
There's 36 of them.
But
that day on 2004, when you're at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, and that's where Dr. King was shot in 1968.
That's correct, yep.
And that's where really the impetus for these icons sprang. And who were the people that you decided to memorialize?
Well, the first
in your
16
icons?
were Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Emmett Till,
Little Rock Nine.
Little Rock Nine. I'm looking at the wall of the museum to figure this. The Freedom Rides, the sit-ins, the 16th Street Baptist Church.
Which had been bombed.
Which had been bombed and killed 4 little girls.
And what year was that? That was 62?
63.
That was the spring of, no, fall of 63.
I'm sorry, the fall of 63.
Okay.
Yeah, September.
Now, the seminal movement of the civil rights movement, or the Seminole March, was Selma to Montgomery.
Yes.
That was in 65.
65. Right. And that's when Dr. King led approximately 40,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Right. That was the third attempt.
That was
the first attempt was Bloody Sunday, where they were horribly bludgeoned.
Now, Bloody Sunday, let's go back to that for a second. That predates the Selma March, obviously, as you alluded to, as you referred to. But John Lewis, who is the current representative, was at the forefront of that and got badly beaten.
He did. Yes, he did.
And I remember one snippet in your book. He looked at one of his
great story.
One of his cohorts, and they were leading the march.
Hosea Williams.
Leading the march across the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they saw the wall of troopers that was there to stop them. And he looked at Mr. Williams and he said, "Can you swim?" Because they were thinking about taking a little leap off the bridge. And Williams said no. And Lewis says, "Well, either can I, so I guess we better keep marching."
That's right.
Right. Yeah. John Lewis told us that story.
Told us that in person.
Yeah. And now, what was the occasion when you met him?
We met him on the 2004 trip to
the Ebenezer Baptist Church.
At the church in Atlanta.
In Atlanta.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he spoke to the group. These were really 100 high schoolers. We happened to be. We ended up going with them.
You actually went with the high school
kids. The Sojourn
as
to
a
the Past.
chaperone, I guess.
Sojourn to the Past, which is done by Jeff Steinberg and other teachers from California. Mm-hmm. We found out about it. They've done about 35 of these trips since the time we went, and they continue to go on these trips, educating kids. And
how has that come across? What impact do you think that has had?
The kids are absolutely...
Are they stunned?
Totally stunned. They get into workshops as to how they're going to go back to their community and make change, do things about the racism that's happening and so forth. It is very powerful. One of the slides...
Because this needs to be remembered. It can't be forgotten.
And
a lot of people...
And they have a lot of books.
And I confess on some points myself, we're not cognizant of all the tribulations and trials.
Right.
While those buses are traveling in 2004, there were films, Eyes on the Prize, other films between locations. The kids had so many books they needed to read and report on. It was not just a cruise, I'll tell you. Those kids had to work hard.
We also met, we and the kids met a number of the people who were involved in the movement.
And some of their stories are actually interspersed throughout.
Yes,
that's right.
What did you do? You took out a tape recorder and interviewed them?
In some cases we did. One of the recordings that we did was much later. I tell in the book, we had occasion to have this icon show at the Groton's prep school. And it was up there over Martin Luther King, or Black History Month, I guess it was, a few years back. And one of the speakers at the Black History Month celebration that they were having at the school was a man by the name of
Reverend Wheeler Parker.
Wheeler Parker,
cousin of Emmett Till, who was with Emmett Till.
Okay, now describe the situation. I'm sorry, Reverend.
No, that's okay. No, that's
describe the situation with Emmett Till, because I do want to hit on some of the icons.
Sure.
Emmett Till was a 14-year-old young man in what, 66?
55.
55.
55.
And he went from Chicago down south with other cousins for the summer
to visit,
to visit his uncle in Money, Mississippi.
Yeah.
He was told it's different down there. You don't look a white person straight in the eye. You look down, and so forth and so on. But he was a precocious kid.
Yeah. And what happened? What did he do?
Well,
he whistled at. Well, allegedly.
Well, first of all, he showed his cousins, friends, of white friends and black friends that he had in Chicago. And they said, "You can't possibly have white friends." "Yeah, even this one's my girlfriend." I mean, he was kidding along.
Yeah.
They challenged him to go into a convenience store.
Well, that's not entirely.
A lot of myth is growing up
well,
around.
there is.
Wheeler Parker tells this cousin. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Well, the long and the short of it was there was some alleged transgression.
He bought something from her, and according to Jeff Steinberg,
he
pressed the money into her hand. He never touched a white person. And
then
as he
left,
left,
then he whistled at her.
That he said, "Bye, babe," and whistled. Now, there are many different stories as to what really occurred, but you can say
Wheeler
Parker's
says
interview with us.
Yeah, Wheeler Parker's interview with us said he was there and he never said, "Bye, babe."
But he's taken from his house a couple days later.
But he was taken from his house a couple of days later, and he was murdered.
Right.
And
your icon of him, I think what you did is you broke off a yardstick or several yardsticks.
Cut off a yardstick at 14 because his life was cut off at 14. And the shorter ones are relabeled 14, 14, 14 to drive home the fact that this was a child of 14. There are cotton gins on either side. There was a 75-pound cotton gin barbed wire to his neck, and he was thrown in the Tallahatchie. Because he was from the north, it shed light on what was going on. After they pulled his body out, there were pieces of other human bodies. It had been a dumping ground by the Klan for years. Horrible, horrible.
And there was another, I know that name is probably fairly well known, but
Yes.
there are some names in
That's
your
right.
icon, in the icons that are less well known.
Right.
And I believe one of your favorite, Reverend, was Vernon Dahmer. Can
Yes,
you
yes.
describe a little bit about him?
Vernon Dahmer was a quite well-to-do landowner in Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
He was a black business owner
Black
as well.
business, yes, and he had a lot of 500 acres, 600 acres of very fine soil and had a
That he
nice
inherited.
farm. He inherited it from it was handed down through his family, but his great-grandfather had been a slave owner and gave the land to his great-grandmother, which we later learned was wasn't common, but it happened from time to time in any event. And he was well respected in the business community and so on and so forth. He was a deacon in the Baptist church and so on. But he was very, very supportive of voting rights, and he let it be known that he would pay the poll tax for those people who wanted to register to vote. This was in '66.
So this is just right
This is
after
right
the
after the
65,
voting right. That's right.
the voting right.
After
But
the voting
he did this
rights
on
Act.
the radio.
He did it on the radio. He advertised on the radio. He had this big farm, and he had a little store, a store that sold his farm products right on the road by the side of the house there. And he said, "I'll pay the poll tax. You come here. I'll give you the money and register you
What
to
was
vote."
the situation about voting in the poll tax? Many of us.
Well,
don't-
poll tax was you had to pay money to register.
Everybody.
Well,
If you were black, I understand.
if you were black, you did. I don't know whether
Okay.
if you were white,
I
maybe you were
understand.
supposed to,
Yep.
but never did. And of course, they had all other kinds of criteria. How many
Sure.
bubbles are on the head of on a soap
Soap.
dish and crazy stuff like that. They made black people go through to register, and of course, they could never answer the
gauntlet.
question.
Or
Yeah.
what does the third paragraph of the Constitution say?
Yeah. So anyway, So one night, some cars pulled up in front of his house and firebombed the house. His wife and daughter and escaped out the back. And he stayed in the house to make sure that they got out. And he died a couple of days later from smoke inhalation.
In the hospital.
In the hospital. We met his daughters, his daughter and his sons. His sons, by the way, were in a military uniform.
While this was happening?
Yeah, overseas.
They were overseas.
Protecting our country.
Yeah. And,
ironic.
Yeah, ironically. And the daughter, when we met her, and Vernon's widow, and the daughter still had some burn
You can
marks
see the scarring
on
on her
and
arms
so on.
from the burns.
But
Horrible.
his mantra was, if you don't vote, you don't count.
That was on his headstone,
And
wasn't
then
right.
they put that on
That's
his
right.
headstone.
Yeah.
There's a picture of us in the book with it.
And
Yeah.
that struck me. And you know, how many times we don't vote because we're not interested. I go to town meetings. Town meetings are a pain in the neck, you know.
Oh, I would
But,
imagine, yeah.
but you know, I go because I remember what that man said and what he laid down his life, you know, so that people could vote.
Right, right. There was another man, an unsung hero, that laid down his life, actually. Pamela, why don't you speak to this? John Daniel.
Jonathan Daniels, we actually went to David's 50th college reunion at Amherst, and Carlton Russell, a friend of his, came over and said, you know, your icons are terrific, but have you ever heard of Jonathan Daniels? I hadn't heard of him. You hadn't heard of him either.
No, I hadn't.
So we researched, and this man from Keene, New Hampshire, had gone down to walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the march, decided to stay there and defer his education at Episcopal Divinity School, wanted to stay on another semester. He was thrown in jail with other SNCC workers. One of the priests, Father Richard Morris Rowe, was with him. They were released from jail. A white man by the name of Tom Coleman came at them with a gun, pointing it right at Ruby Sales, a 16-year-old black girl. Jonathan grabbed her by the shoulders, tossed her aside, took the bullet, and was killed. So naturally, I had to do an icon of him. Morris Rowe was shot in the back and was debilitated for years. He was in the hospital for over a year, fighting for his life. We were invited to go to the Keene Historical Society for the 50th anniversary of Daniel's murder. And the icon I did of him was on the altar of that Episcopal church. It was, and Father Morris Rowe is sitting there in a wheelchair in the congregation. There's a picture of me with him holding the icon in our book.
Speak to another unsung hero, the lady who transported some of the workers during
Viola
Selma.
Liuzzo in Selma.
Yeah.
She saw Bloody Sunday. She stood up, said
Bloody Sunday
Bloody
is
Sunday
the Edmund
was,
Pettus Bridge.
Yes, the first of the attempts. There was 3. It was Turnaround Tuesday, which King had gotten involved and said, I don't want anybody killed. They turned around. The third one, they had a court order that they could do so. So she was in the third march. She she stood up and said, I can't stand it. I'm going down. I'm getting involved. She went on down with her car, which had a Detroit license plate. She was white. Leroy Moten, who was black, was in the front seat with her. She was driving marchers back from Montgomery to Selma. She was spotted by the Klan, and Leroy said, I see those CB antennas, they're after us. She stepped on it. She was going 100 miles an hour when they managed to overtake her car and shoot and kill her through the car window. One evening at 10 o'clock, David comes up to bed and says, somebody's thanking you for doing an icon of their mother. So I got out of bed and I went downstairs, and it was Mary Liuzzo Lillebo, her daughter. Cyberspace is amazing. She said, I love the icon you did of my mother. We've been in touch ever since. I had archival prints made of that and sent them to her children. And then her sister gets involved, Viola's sister, Rosemary Lemming. It's amazing what the internet can do. It connects you everywhere.
Pamela, if you had to do one icon of an action, not of a person, but of an event in the spectrum of the civil rights movement, from the Lorraine Motel to I Have a Dream speech, the Promised Land speech, which I believe was the sanitation workers.
Yes, it was.
In Memphis.
Memphis, that's right.
Was that when he was killed?
The next day he was
The next day he was
Next
killed.
day he was killed.
All right.
I mean, I've done the sit-ins and the freedom marches, which were huge events. I can't think of an event bigger than those two. Can
Right.
you? That I would do? I mean, frankly, my mind is like a popcorn machine. I'm always thinking of things that I want to do.
Yeah.
The Trayvon Martin case,
Yeah.
which is to date, it was like a reenactment of the Emmett Till murder. This young man who had an iced tea and Skittles is gunned down by a man with a gun and gets acquitted. It's unbelievable. So I have this imaginary thing in my mind that I will do one of Trayvon Martin, and there'll be shadows of Emmett Till and other shadows of others that nobody will ever know who were
Right.
murdered for simply
Okay.
being black.
Let's look at the first icon and the most recent icon.
Okay.
The first icon, I'd like you to describe a little about him.
This one is of Jonathan Walker, who was a captain, born in Harwich in 1799. An amazing man who became an abolitionist. He was living in Florida, and he was out on the high seas. Some 4 slaves came to him, runaway slaves, and said, "Would you take us to Barbados, where slavery has been made illegal?" He said, "Okay, meet me at 8 o'clock at night." 7 of them show up. He gets on board knowing he doesn't even have enough rations for everybody, but he's out on the high seas, and the
they were arrested.
bounty hunters caught him, took him to the Pensacola jail, and branded his hand with an SS for slave stealer. Frederick Douglass, who was a famous abolitionist, said, "Oh no, I know this man well. That stands for slave savior." So he's a well-known now abolitionist in the Harwich Historical Society. As a matter of fact, I did another one to donate to the Historical Society.
Wow. Yeah.
So-
Okay. And most recently.
Most recent one, in June of 2016, a busload of people from the South Carolina came in. Some woman came over to me after I did my talk and said, "That woman over there, her sister was one of the 9 murdered in the Charleston AME church during a Bible study." I went over to her, introduced myself. Marjorie McIver is her name. I said, "I'm so sorry. I understand your sister was one of the ones murdered." As she cried, I cried. As I held her, she said to me, "My sister had 8 bullets in her body."
Oh.
I've been in touch with Marjorie ever since. We are flying her to Harwich, to Boston, and then to Harwich for the dedication of this icon on
Oh, that's
May
great.
21st,
Wonderful.
which is
wonderful.
coming up, and she
Well-
will speak about the kind. But the icon was done to honor these. I don't want the word Dylan Roof to be the only name remembered. I want these
Amen.
9 people to be known, their beautiful lives, their contributions to life and society. I want them to be honored, and that's why I did it.
Well, what passion you have for this movement and such an important part of American history. Your book certainly pays homage to the civil rights movement. I want to thank you very much for all the work that you've done, and it is a wonderful, wonderful gift to us, your book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.